the first thing I'd like to do is to thank Bloomberg Green and Mike Bloomberg in particular. And we're very proud indeed that we should be part of this series. Now look, let me say something about our family. The founder of our family, Mariam Rothschild, lived in Frankfurt in a one-story, large-room house with 17 other people. And I'll just read to you something which Goethe said about the ghetto in Frankfurt at that time. The confinement, the dirt, the swarm of people, the accents of an unpleasant tongue, all made a disagreeable impression, even when one only looked in when passing outside the gate. It's a long time before I ventured in alone, and I didn't return easily after once escaping the obtrusiveness of so many people, untiringly intent on haggling, either demanding or offering. So let's look, Hannah, at the history of our family for a bit since those days in the ghetto. I mean, they spent, I think, the first part of the 19th century making lots of money. I think they spent a lot of the second half of the 19th century spending it. They built altogether 44 houses. They collected like mad. They bought lots of land. And then came the 20th century with 2 world wars, high taxation. And of those 44 houses, only one really remains with its collections intact, visited by 450,000 people a year. And around the actual manor house, there are 5,500 acres of land, which we look after. So there couldn't be a bigger difference between how things were in the ghetto and how things were by the end of the 19th century and how you can start seeing the problems of the 20th century. Now today, we're blessed, we have this incredible property. We have a collection of 25,000 works of art. We have 400, as I was saying earlier, we have 450,000 visitors. A characteristic, I think, of English heritage properties is that they tend to look backwards. And our ambition here is much more to look forwards, or to accompany the past at least. And we care passionately about climate change. And how does that reflect itself? Well, we built this building 12 years ago, and we convene here and talk about these issues. So we did one with the Smith School in Oxford. We've done others, and about 10 years ago now, we did a thing with Oxford University with Bill Clinton and David Attenborough to talk about climate change. But the problem, I'm afraid, gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and harder to deal with. I mean, if you take, it reminds me a little bit of the problems of Corona, because if you take China, I mean, a few years ago, they were 3% of carbon emissions. Today, they're 27%, and we all mind. But then you say to yourself, well, at the same time, they took 2 billion people out of poverty. So how much do you sacrifice on climate change in order to bring people out of poverty? It's a big question. But what one is absolutely sure of is that there's an immense amount to do, and we're trying to do our bit here. And you might, Hannah, like to talk a bit about the farming side.
Of course. It's so interesting hearing about the historical context of the family, because, of course, our interest in climate change goes back many hundreds of years. If you think about your grandfather, Charles, my great-grandfather, who, after all, was one of the first conservationists in the world, actually. Do you remember his story and how he started? Because it's rather amazing.
Charles, well, yes. I mean, Charles he was the father figure of Nature Conservancy, and in 1914 there was a famous meeting at the Natural History Museum when he put his hat into the ring, bought a large nature reserve, and from then on there were 284 more. So he was a crucial figure, and our side of the family, that's been consistent because the elder brother, Walter, who was a very eccentric man, Walter Rothschild, who built the museum at Tring, he devoted his life to wildlife, to put it simply, and animals. So there was that strong tradition which was carried on by my Aunt Miriam, who also devoted her life to wildlife and nature. My father was a scientist. So you see increasing concerns in the century, and perhaps it was with expensive banking, but equally now, of course, one of the things, in addition to those that I very briefly described, we do think a lot about, is how can we invest our resources to good effect to help with climate change. And I think there are any number of ways. I mean, you can support venture capital and people who are taking worthwhile initiatives. Our dream is, if you look across this building to the building on the other side, that one day that will become a center of, say, agricultural technology, ag tech, and of venture capital, which will help with climate change. So this place, we hope, will become a center for those activities. And let me be frank, we've come to that conclusion, helped just by the evidence that's been mounting over the last decades, but also, frankly, I think because of the Bloomberg Green Initiative, it's made us try harder.
So I think picking up from something that you've said, I think we feel as a family that we're custodians of the land. We don't own it. We're not here to maximize our returns. What we feel is that we've got to leave it in a better shape for the next generation. And once upon a time, I think there was a kind of pressure, that people who were seen as climate change activists or people who wanted to farm in that way had to wear sackcloths and eat lentils and, trips around in the moonlight. But actually, what we've discovered here through our farming practices on the 5,000 acres around where we're sitting is that you can do an enormous amount to regenerate the soil, actually in-house. So, for example, we harvest our rainwater. We make sure that the 750,000 meters of hedgerow are properly planted to help insects and wildlife. We have photovoltaic cells, to gather sunlight. And we make this wonderful microbiome mixture that we put back into the soil.
And there's another point too, which is even the builder of Waddesdon in the 1880s, I didn't know this until the other day, but he created 40 woods. And I think it's fair to say that in our generation, we've also created about 40 woods.
I mean, you've planted at least 40 woods, which has been incredibly exciting. Yeah,
it's crucial to carbon emissions.
And what we do with those woods are marvelous. So we take the dead wood out of the woods that both our forebears planted and that you're planting, and we make charcoal. And that charcoal goes back into this wonderful mulch that we then put back into the land. Right. And in many ways, we're actually farming the land going back, many, many hundreds of years, long before we existed, using crop rotation, using animals, putting things back into the soil. And I think both you and I share this belief that, in a way, instant gratification is the worst thing that you can do. So in other words, if you want to have a really fast turnover of crops, you can drown the soil with chemicals. Or you say, actually, what we're interested in is the quality of what we grow. Yeah. And we don't drown the chemical, we don't drown it in chemicals. So I think that you can do a hell of a lot by not necessarily causing a revolution.
I quite agree. I mean, I think the sort of fight against fertilizers, we can demonstrate to children in this area that it really has an impact and means something.
Yeah, I mean, none of us would want to kind of get our breakfast cereal and pour a whole lot of chemicals on it and then go yummy. And we wouldn't want to do that with our land either. And look, we're very lucky, I think. We have this land. We have the opportunity to make a difference. And we're doing it. But we're not kind of doing it a Marie Antoinette, Petit Trianon way. We're actually producing crops each year, and we're producing livestock. But we're doing it in a sustainable, regenerative way.
No, it's fantastic. I mean, if it makes a profit, we give it. We also, if it does make a profit, it does sometimes, we give it back, frankly.
Absolutely. And I love the fact that you are so forward-thinking, you know, in business. So I love the fact that we're thinking about creating an agri-tech centre over there, that we're actually using, for example, the latest technology, say with drones. So we're using drones to fly over the land to see where one might need a chemical, but it's only used in a tiny, tiny, tiny amount because drone technology can help us.
I mean, I think the phenomenal change that's come about in the last 2 or 3 years is there probably isn't a child over the age of 6 that isn't deeply concerned about climate change. I mean, there were reports in the past, but now the focus of the world are on those problems, whether it's droughts, whether it's storms, whether it's the seaside being ruined, just undermining life.
Everything. And in a way, Corona has slightly, I'm afraid, eclipsed the importance of this conversation. No one's saying Corona isn't incredibly devastating, but actually we do need to think long term about the planet.
Yeah, and it's a distraction, well, more than a distraction, it's a tragedy, but it does have that knock-on effect.
I mean, I would hope that the vision that we are coming up with here, which is that we've got land which we can look after very well and set an example, you know, not in a proselytizing way, but I hope in attraction rather than promotion. We've got these extraordinary buildings, one of which we're sitting in now, and one, as you pointed out, where we can convene the latest and the greatest thinkers, thanks to people like Bloomberg Green and other, organizations, so that we can bring, and we've got the history, so we can bring those 3 strands together, I think, and try and make a difference.
It's incredible what Bloomberg Green has done and what Mark Bloomberg has done in this area. It really, I think, is as important as the government and intergovernment initiatives like the Stern Report 20 years ago, like Kyoto, like Paris. I mean, you now have almost every single human being in the world deeply concerned about climate change. And I think Bloomberg Green has really put the focus on the problem in the most remarkable way. It's made a huge contribution.
So, of course, next year we're planning to have Bloomberg Green, you know, here in person rather than virtually. It's lovely having everyone here virtually, but what we really want to do is to welcome everyone here, show them what we're up to, and use our power to convene and cajole and entertain, I think, to give everyone a really interesting time and to produce some tangible results.
That's right. No, we're hoping that there'll be about 500 people who will be all interested in this subject who will contribute to it, and it's a great opportunity for us.
No, it's really exciting. I think it'll be fantastic.